The Alpha King's pup suffered every day, until the new maid discovered a terrifying secret hidden in his fur. Nora had walked for 3 days to reach Blackthorn Castle, and by the time she saw its black towers rising over the pine hills, her shoes had worn through at the heel, and her stomach had stopped growling and gone quiet, the way hunger does when it gives up asking. She was 22 years old, with rough hands from years of splitting firewood in her father's yard, and she had exactly one skill that mattered to anyone in this world. She was not afraid of hard work, and she was not afraid of animals, even the wild ones. The castle was hiring. Word had spread through 3 villages that the royal household needed kitchen girls and cellar hands, and Nora had packed a single bag and left before her stepmother could talk her out of it, or worse, talk her into staying and marrying the miller's son, who smelled like flour and boredom. She did not know much about King Cale Ashvale, only what everyone knew, that he was young, that he was hard, that he ruled the Blackthorn pack the way a blacksmith rules a hammer, with control and without apology. People said a lot of things. She was hired within an hour of arriving, mostly because the head housekeeper took one look at her calloused hands and said, "Good, you already know what work is," and put her to scrubbing floors before she'd even set down her bag. The castle itself was bigger than any building Nora had ever stood inside, big enough that she got lost twice on her first day, trying to find her way back from the laundry room to the kitchens, and had to ask a passing guard for directions, which earned her a laugh and a raised eyebrow, as if new girls getting lost in the halls was the most ordinary thing in the world. In a way, she supposed it was. She counted 11 other servants in her first week alone, some kind and some tired, and some simply too busy to notice her, and she learned quickly that the fastest way to belong somewhere new was to keep her head down, do the work in front of her, and ask questions only when she truly needed the answer. She wrote one letter home in her first week, to her father, telling him she'd found a position and a roof, and enough food that her stomach had finally stopped its constant complaining. She did not write to her stepmother, and she told herself that wasn't spite, just practicality, since her stepmother could not read anyway, and had never once pretended to care where Nora ended up, as long as it wasn't underfoot. The work itself did not frighten her. She had grown up doing far worse for far less thanks, and there was something almost restful about scrubbing a floor until it shone, about doing a task with a clear beginning and a clear end, when so much of her life before this had felt like effort poured into a hole that never filled. What frightened her, in the strange and specific way things frighten a person only once they've had time to sit and think about them, was how quiet the castle went after dark. Not peaceful quiet, careful quiet. The kind of quiet that made you feel like everyone around you had agreed, without ever discussing it out loud, to stop noticing certain things. It was on her 4th night, long after the kitchen fires had died down to orange coals and the rest of the staff had gone to bed, that Nora first heard the sound. It came from below the kitchens, through a grate in the floor that let heat rise up from the coal cellar. A low sound, not quite a growl and not quite a cry, the kind of sound something makes when it has stopped expecting anyone to come. She asked the cook about it the next morning, a heavy-set woman named Bet, who had flour permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles. "That's the kennel beast," Bet said, not looking up from her dough. "Leave it be." "What beast?" "Something the king keeps. Nobody's business what or why. Steward Voss feeds it, and that's the end of it. You go near that cellar, girl. You'll lose your position faster than you found it." Nora nodded and said nothing more, because she had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to get in trouble was to argue with the person who fed you. But that night, she went to the cellar anyway. She told herself she only wanted to look. The coal cellar was cold and black except for one thin beam of moonlight falling through a high window, and in that beam she saw him, a wolf, but wrong somehow, too young, too small for the chain wrapped 3 times around his neck and bolted to the wall. His ribs showed through fur that had gone dull and patchy in places. One eye was scarred shut, the lid sunk in a way that told her it had healed wrong a long time ago and nobody had ever cared for it properly. He was pressed into the corner where the wall met the floor, as far from the door as the chain would allow, and when she stepped closer, he flinched before she had even lifted a hand. That flinch did something to her chest. She had seen dogs do that before, dogs that had been kicked so many times they stopped waiting to see if the hand coming toward them was gentle. She had never seen it on something with eyes that looked, for one strange second, almost human. "Hey," she said softly, crouching down, keeping her hands where he could see them. "I'm not going to hurt you." He didn't move. He watched her the way prisoners watch new guards, waiting to learn the shape of this one's cruelty. She had brought half a heel of bread in her apron pocket, meant for her own breakfast, and she set it down just inside the reach of his chain, and backed away to sit against the far wall. She didn't reach for him. She didn't talk at him in a baby voice the way some people did with animals, like the softness of the voice made up for the fact that they were treating you like you couldn't understand plain words. She just sat and waited and let the silence do the convincing. It took almost 20 minutes, but eventually, keeping his one good eye on her the whole time, the pup crept forward and ate the bread in 3 fast bites, like he expected it to be taken away before he finished. "There," Nora said quietly. "That wasn't so hard." She came back the next night, and the night after that. The second visit was harder than the first, not because the pup was less afraid, but because she was more aware, now, of exactly how much trouble she'd be in if anyone found her there. She waited until she heard the last of the kitchen staff climb the stairs to the servants' quarters, until the only sounds left in the castle were the settling creaks of old stone cooling after a day of fires, and then she slipped down with a strip of dried meat, wrapped in a bit of cloth, and her heart going faster than the short walk down the stairs could really explain. He was waiting in the same corner, and this time he didn't flinch quite as badly when she came into the moonlight. She counted that as progress. She sat, same as before, back against the cold stone, and let him decide in his own time whether tonight was a night for trusting her. "You don't have to like me," she told him, unwrapping the meat slowly, so the sound of the cloth wouldn't startle him. "I just figured somebody chained in the dark with no food probably isn't in the mood to be picky about company." He made a low sound in his throat that wasn't quite a growl, and she decided, without much evidence beyond a hopeful guess, that it was closer to agreement than complaint. By the end of the first week, she had a routine: sneak down after the kitchen closed, bring whatever scraps she could hide in her apron without Bet noticing, sit with him for a while, sometimes talk about nothing in particular, the way you'd talk to fill a quiet room. She told him about her father's farm, about the way her stepmother made her feel like a guest in her own house, about how she'd walked 3 days to get here because staying had started to feel like drowning slowly in something that never even had the decency to look like water. She told him things, in fact, that she had never said out loud to another living person, because there was something freeing about talking to a creature who couldn't repeat it, couldn't judge it, couldn't do anything but sit and listen with his one good eye fixed steadily on her face. She told him about the year her mother died, and how her father had remarried too quickly, out of loneliness more than love, and how the woman who moved into their house after that had never once looked at Nora like she belonged there. She told him about the miller's son, and how everyone in the village had assumed she'd marry him eventually, the way water assumes it will eventually reach the bottom of a hill, simply because there was nothing stopping it, and no one had bothered to ask if that was really where it wanted to go. By the second week, the pup had started shuffling closer during these visits, close enough that she could rest a hand lightly against his side while she talked, feeling the fast, nervous rhythm of his breathing slowly ease into something calmer under her palm. She noticed, too, that he seemed to wait for her, that some nights, when she came down later than usual, held up by extra chores, he would already be sitting upright and alert by the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, as though he'd heard her coming long before she arrived, or perhaps had simply been listening for her the whole time she was gone. He listened. She was almost sure of it. He would tilt his head at certain words, the way a dog does when it catches a tone it recognizes, but there was something more deliberate in it, something that made her feel, more than once, like she was talking to a person who simply couldn't answer back. One night she brought a rag and a bit of warm water and, very slowly, cleaned the wound around his ruined eye, the crusted mess that had clearly never been treated. He let her. He shook the whole time, muscles trembling under her hands, but he let her, and when she was done he pressed his head, just for a second, against her knee. That was the night Nora decided she didn't care what Bet said, or what the rules were, or what happened to her position. Whatever this animal was, whoever had decided he deserved a cellar and a chain and a dulled coat of fur, they were wrong, and she was not going to be one more person who walked past that and called it none of her business. She started noticing things she hadn't noticed at first, because she hadn't been looking closely enough. The pup was never in the cellar during the day. Steward Voss came each morning before sunrise and took him somewhere, and he did not return until dusk. And each time he came back hurt in new ways. A split in his lip, bruised, swollen skin along one front leg. Once, deep scratches across his shoulder that looked less like an animal's claws and more like something scraped by fingernails. She asked Voss about it, carefully, framing it as simple concern for an animal in her care. Where does he go during the day? Steward Voss was a tall, gray man with a face that gave away nothing, the kind of servant who had spent so many years managing other people's secrets that he'd forgotten how to have an expression of his own. "That is not something you need to know," he said. "Continue your duties. Do not go near the beast again. He needs someone to look after him properly." "He has someone," Voss said, and something in his voice made her go still, though she couldn't have said exactly why. "Leave it, girl. For your own good, leave it." She didn't leave it. She kept coming. There was one night, near the end of the second week, that Nora would think back on often in the months that followed, though at the time it had felt like nothing more than an ordinary evening among many. She had come down later than usual, exhausted from a day spent beating dust out of every tapestry in the West Hall, and instead of sitting against the far wall the way she usually did, she simply slid down beside the pup and let her head rest back against the cold stone, too tired to hold herself upright any longer. He shifted closer to her in the dark, slow and careful, the way he always moved when he wasn't sure his closeness would be welcome, and when she didn't pull away, he settled his head against her leg with a small huff of breath that sounded, for all the world, like relief. "Long day," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Feels like everyone in this castle needs something from somebody else, all day long, and nobody stops to ask if the person doing the work is holding up all right." He made a low sound in response, and she found herself laughing quietly, surprising herself with it. "I know, you'd think an animal chained in a cellar has the worst end of the bargain here, and you'd be right, but I'm allowed to complain about my aching arms too, aren't I?" She fell asleep like that, more by accident than intention, her hand resting on his back, rising and falling with his breathing, and when she woke with a start sometime before dawn, heart pounding at the thought of being caught, she found he hadn't moved either, hadn't pulled away or grown restless while she slept, just stayed exactly where he was, keeping her company in the dark, the same steady way she'd been keeping his. She hurried back up to the servants' quarters that morning with her pulse still too fast and a strange warmth in her chest that she didn't examine too closely, because examining it felt like it might lead somewhere she wasn't ready to follow yet. It was 2 weeks after her arrival that Nora was first sent to clean the king's private study, as punishment, Bet told her, for wasting good food on a chained animal. Someone had noticed the missing scraps, though not, thankfully, noticed her. She had never been this close to King Kale before. She had seen him from a distance, crossing the training yard, tall and broad-shouldered, moving like every step had already been decided before his foot left the ground. Up close, in the low afternoon light of his study, he was worse. Not worse in looks, because there was nothing wrong with his looks. That was almost the problem. He was the kind of handsome that made a person's thoughts go quiet for a second before their good sense caught up. Worse in the way his eyes moved over her, like she was furniture that had wandered somewhere it shouldn't be. "You're the one feeding the kennel beast," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Your Majesty." Against direct instruction. He was starving, she said, and then, because she had never learned when to stop talking, and hurt, and nobody was doing anything about it, so yes, I fed him. She expected anger. What she got instead was something quieter and colder, a long look that lasted just a beat too long, like he was trying to work out a puzzle he hadn't expected to find in his study that afternoon. "You will stop," he said finally. "That is not a request. With respect, Your Majesty, I don't understand why an animal that's already chained needs to be starved on top of it. You don't need to understand, he said. You need to obey. She held his eyes for one more second than was probably wise, and then bent back to her scrubbing, because arguing with a king was a fast way to end up back on the road she'd walked in on. But as she worked, she noticed him shift his weight, favoring his left side, and when he reached for a paper on his desk, he held his left hand strangely stiff, the way a person holds a hand that's been recently, badly hurt. It was the exact way the pup favored his own front leg. She kept her eyes on the floor, on the brush moving in slow circles across the stone, and let the silence stretch, hoping he'd forget she was in the room, the way people in power often did with servants once the scolding was finished. He didn't forget. She could feel him watching her from behind his desk, the weight of his attention like a hand pressed flat against her back, and when she finally risked a glance up, she found him not glaring at her the way she'd expected, but studying her, quiet and unreadable, like a man trying to solve an equation that refused to balance. "You're not from the villages near here," he said eventually. It wasn't quite a question either, the same way his first words to her hadn't been. "No, Your Majesty. 3 days' walk south. Why come this far for kitchen work? There are closer households hiring." She considered lying, giving him some polished answer about ambition or opportunity, the kind of thing she imagined a king wanted to hear. But something about the tiredness under his eyes made her decide the truth cost her nothing. "Because staying where I was felt like it was going to be the rest of my life, and I wanted a life that was actually mine before I agreed to anything." Something flickered across his face at that, gone almost before she registered it, but she thought, though she wouldn't have sworn to it, that it might have been recognition. "That," he said, "is either very brave or very foolish. I've been told it's usually both, Your Majesty." He almost smiled. She saw the shape of it start at the corner of his mouth before he caught it and put it away, like a man closing a door on a room he wasn't ready to let anyone see into. "Finish the study," he said, turning back to his papers, his voice gone flat and formal again. "And stay away from the cellar. I won't tell you again." It was the first order he ever gave her that she had absolutely no intention of obeying. She told herself it was nothing. Lots of people had sore arms. It meant nothing at all. She kept telling herself that for 3 more nights, right up until the night everything changed. It was late, later than she usually came down, because she'd been kept in the kitchen scrubbing pots until her arms ached. When she finally slipped into the cellar, the pup was curled tight in the corner, shaking harder than she'd ever seen, and there was a wound along his shoulder that looked fresh and angry, the fur matted down with blood gone dark and sticky. "Oh, hold still. Let me look," she whispered, kneeling beside him. She parted the fur carefully to clean around the wound, the way she'd done a dozen times before, and that was when her fingers brushed something that wasn't fur at all, a patch of raised, scarred skin just beneath the wound, hidden under the coat, shaped in a way that was too deliberate, too symmetrical to be an accident. A brand, old, healed over, but unmistakably a brand, the kind pressed into skin on purpose, by someone who wanted a mark that would last. Nora had seen that exact shape once before, 2 weeks ago, in the training yard, when King Kale's shirt had torn during a sparring match and, for one careless second before he'd yanked it back into place, she'd seen the same mark burned into the skin of his own shoulder. Her hands went still. "No," she said quietly to herself, to the dark cellar, to the pup who watched her with his one good eye like he already knew what she was about to understand. "No, that can't be." She sat back on her heels, her heart doing something strange and fast in her chest, and she made herself think it through slowly, the way her father had taught her to work through a hard piece of firewood, not fighting it, just finding the grain and following it. The pup vanished every dawn. The pup came back every dusk. Every wound he carried matched a wound she'd seen, hours later, on the king. The mark under his fur matched the mark on the king's shoulder. She did not want to believe it. Believing it made the world a much stranger and much more frightening place than the one she'd woken up in that morning. But she had never once been able to make herself unsee something just because it was inconvenient, and she couldn't do it now either. She stayed. She told herself she wasn't staying to test her own theory, but she was, and somewhere in the deepest, most honest part of herself, she knew it. The hours before dawn were the longest she could remember sitting through since the week her mother had died, when she'd kept a similar vigil beside a different bed, waiting for a different kind of change she hadn't wanted to see arrive. She didn't sleep. She barely moved. The pup, sensing something different in her stillness, pressed close against her side and stayed there, and she found herself stroking the fur along his neck without quite deciding to. The way you comfort someone else, to keep from admitting how badly you need comforting yourself. Somewhere past the middle of the night, she made herself consider, honestly, what she would do if her theory turned out to be true. She could go straight to Bet in the morning, tell her everything, let the castle's rumor mill do what it did best, and watch the truth spread through the servants' halls by breakfast. She could pack her bag before sunrise and be 3 villages away by nightfall, pretend she'd never come down these stairs at all, never sat in this cellar, never let a chained animal matter to her more than her own safety probably should have allowed. Both of those were sensible choices. Both of those were choices a smarter, more careful person than her might have made. She knew, somewhere around the 3rd hour of sitting there in the dark with his head against her leg, that she wasn't going to make either of them. Dawn came slow and gray through the high window, the kind of light that seems to hesitate before it fully arrives. Nora sat with her back against the cold stone, watching, barely breathing, as the light strengthened. It happened without warning, and without any of the ceremony she might have expected from stories. One moment the pup was there, curled in the corner. The next, his shape seemed to blur, like something seen through water, and then it was not a pup curled in the corner at all, but a man, bare-shouldered, chained by the wrists in the exact spot the pup's chain had been, breathing hard, like the change itself had cost him something. It was King Kale. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them moved. He looked up and found her there, and she watched the exact instant he understood what she now knew, watched something in his face crack open and then slam shut again, faster than she would have thought possible. "Get out," he said. His voice was raw, torn up from disuse, but the command in it hadn't lost an ounce of its weight. "Your Majesty, get out." She didn't move. Her legs had gone strangely solid, rooted to the stone floor, and beneath the fear, because there was fear, plenty of it, she was alone in a cellar with an enraged king who could have her thrown from the castle, or worse, before the sun finished rising. Beneath the fear was something steadier. She thought of 3 weeks of bread shared through chain links. She thought of a head pressed against her knee in the dark. "No," she said. He stared at her like the word had physically struck him. "You do not say no to your king." "I'm not talking to my king right now," she said, and her voice shook, but she kept it steady enough to be heard. "I'm talking to the wolf I've been feeding for 3 weeks, and he doesn't scare me." Something in his face changed, not softened exactly, but shifted, like a door easing off a lock it had been jammed against for a long time. "You will tell no one," he said, quieter now, but no less fierce. "You understand me? No one. If this reaches the wrong ears." "I understand," she said. "I'm not going to tell anyone, but I am going to help you." "You can't." "Why not?" He didn't answer right away. He looked down at the chains around his wrists, at his own bare chest still marked with the fading edges of a brand he clearly hadn't chosen, and for the first time since she'd met him, King Kale Ashvale looked less like a king and more like a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long he'd forgotten what his own back felt like without it. "Because," he said finally, "I don't know how." Nora had never in her life let a locked door stop her from finding the key, and she wasn't going to start with this one. Over the following days, carefully, in stolen minutes, in whispered conversations, when Voss wasn't watching, she pieced together the story, and it was worse than she'd imagined. 3 years ago, before Kale's father had died and left him the crown, the old king had gone to war against a small coven of witches who lived on land the royal family wanted for its timber. The coven had not been dangerous. They had been poor and stubborn and unwilling to leave the only home most of them had ever known. The old king had burned them out anyway, and in the chaos, Most of the coven had died. One had survived, an old woman named Marin, the coven's last true witch, who had watched her family burn and had sworn, with the very last of her power, that the Ashvale bloodline would never be whole again. She placed the curse not on Cale's father, who died of an unrelated illness within the year, but on his son, the one who would inherit the crown and everything that came with it. And she bound the enforcement of that curse to a single bloodline of the castle's own staff, the Voss family, in exchange for one promise, that a Voss daughter, born generations later, would always be granted safe passage and protection, no matter what came. Stuart Voss's own daughter was 7 years old, and living quietly in a village 2 days' ride from the castle, under a false name, under his careful protection that only held as long as the curse held too. "He's not doing this because he wants to," Nora said, working it through out loud one night in the cellar. Cale human now, they had learned, in these stolen hours near dawn, that the two of them could talk more freely once he'd already changed. "He's protecting his own child." "That doesn't make it forgivable," Cale said. His voice had gone flat, the way voices do when a person is too tired to be as angry as the situation deserves. 3 years, Nora. 3 years of half my life spent as an animal in my own cellar, and he knew the whole time. He watched me flinch at hands raised to feed me. He let it happen because it was easier than losing his daughter. "I'm not saying it's forgivable," Nora said. "I'm saying it's the kind of thing a person does when they've been backed into a corner with no good doors left. That doesn't make him innocent. It makes him someone we might be able to reason with, if we're smart about it, instead of someone we have to fight." Cale looked at her for a long moment. "You say we very easily, for someone who could walk away from all of this tonight and never look back." "I could," Nora agreed. "I'm not going to." "Why?" She thought about it honestly before she answered. "Because he deserved an honest answer and not a pretty one. Because I watched something suffer for 3 weeks and I couldn't make myself look away. I don't think I know how to stop now that I've started." It wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth had more to do with the way he'd looked at her that first morning in his study, furious and controlled, and somehow, underneath all of it, so tired, and the way that tiredness had cracked something open in her chest that she hadn't been ready for. But it was true enough, and it was all she was willing to say out loud that night. They confronted Voss 3 nights later, in the small hours when the rest of the castle slept, in the cellar where it had all started. Cale's younger sister, Leora, came too. She had known about the curse from the beginning, the only member of the family Cale had trusted with it, and she had spent 3 years quietly exhausted from the effort of covering for her brother's disappearances, making excuses to the court, watching him grow more distant and more brittle with every cycle. Leora was younger than Cale by 4 years, sharp-eyed and quick-tongued in a way that made most of the court a little nervous around her. But in the cellar that night she looked, for the first time since Nora had met her, genuinely uncertain. She stood close to her brother's shoulder, not quite touching him, the way people do when they want to offer comfort but aren't sure it will be welcome. "I covered for you," she said to Cale quietly, before anyone else had spoken. "Every single time. Told the court you were unwell, told the visiting lords you kept unusual hours, told our own mother's old advisors that you needed rest, when what I really meant was that I was watching my brother disappear into an animal every single night, and I didn't have the first idea how to stop it. I want you to know that. I want you to know I never stopped trying to find a way out of this, even when I didn't say it out loud." "I know," Cale said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word, the first real crack Nora had heard in it since the morning in the study. "I know, Leora. I never blamed you. I blamed myself enough for both of us," Leora said, and let the subject drop there, because there would be time later, once all of this was finished, to talk properly about 3 years of shared, silent grief. Voss did not deny anything when they laid it out in front of him. He simply sat down on an overturned crate, an old man suddenly, all the careful blankness gone from his face, and put his head in his hands. "I have hated myself every single day," he said. "You think I don't know what I've done. I have watched a boy I helped raise turned into something chained in the dark, and I told myself it was the price of keeping my daughter safe, and I told myself that every single morning, because if I stopped telling myself that, I don't know what I would have done. You could have told me, Kale said, and there was more grief in it than anger now, which somehow made it land harder. Any of it. All of it. I would have found another way. I would have found some other way to keep her safe that didn't cost me 3 years of my own life. Would you have? Voss asked, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Truly? Or would you have gone to your father's old allies looking for a way to break it by force, the way your father would have, and gotten yourself, and my daughter, and half this castle killed in the process? I made a choice 3 years ago, Your Majesty, and it was not a good choice, and I have known that every single night I've had to look at what I did to you and call it necessary. But I do not regret keeping her alive. I will never regret that. I only regret that I let myself believe those were the only 2 options in front of me. The cellar went quiet after that, filled only with the small sounds of 4 people breathing in a room that had, until recently, held nothing but chains and cold stone and one suffering silent animal. There's a way to end it, Nora said finally, into that quiet. There has to be. Curses like this aren't usually meant to last forever. They're meant to be broken by someone. Otherwise, what was the point of the witch making it a curse, instead of just killing him outright? Voss was quiet for a long moment. The old woman's binding was clear, when my grandfather first explained it to my father, who explained it to me. The curse ends when someone chooses to care for the wolf without knowing the man, freely, without being told what they're caring for, without hope of reward. It has to be a choice made in ignorance and kept in truth. That was the cruelty of it. She built a door that could only be opened by someone who had no idea a door existed. Nora felt the room go very still. Someone like that, Voss said slowly, looking at her now, really looking at her for the first time, would need to complete the act with full knowledge. At the end, choose it again, now that they know everything. Kale's head turned sharply toward her. No, he said. No, absolutely not. We are not asking her to. I'm already choosing it, Nora said, before he could finish. I chose it 3 weeks ago, the first night I sat down in this cellar with a piece of bread. I didn't know what you were then. I know now. I'm still choosing it. You don't understand what you're agreeing to, Kale said. There could be a cost. There's always a cost with old magic like this. Voss, tell her. There is a cost, Voss admitted quietly. But it isn't hers to carry. The old magic asks for a piece of what created the curse in the first place. My family bound this curse. My family can be the ones to pay the price of ending it. That's fair, I think, after 3 years of being its keeper. Voss. Let me do this one right thing, Voss said, and there was something in his voice. Not quite peace, but something close to it. The sound of a man finally putting down a weight he'd been carrying so long his arms had forgotten how to hang normally at his sides. Let me choose something myself, for once, instead of only obeying. What the price turned out to be was this: Voss's protection over the curse, the thing that had bound his family to serving and silently enforcing it for 3 generations, would be broken along with the curse itself, and with it, whatever old magic had kept the Coven's revenge alive at all. It would cost him his position, likely his place at court, possibly the comfortable life he'd built shielding his daughter from a truth she'd never known. He would have to start over somewhere far from the castle, with a child who would finally get to grow up without a secret sitting over her whole life like weather that never broke. It did not cost him his life, though for one terrible suspended moment, as the old magic gathered in the cellar like a held breath, none of them were entirely sure that it wouldn't. Nora knelt beside Kale, who had gone still and pale, bracing for whatever came next, and she took his hand, the same hand she'd once cleaned a wound on when it was a paw and not a hand at all, and held it the way you hold something you have decided, fully and without reservation, to keep. I choose this, she said, out loud, clearly, the way Voss had told her the old magic required. I chose it not knowing. I choose it again, knowing everything. The light in the cellar changed. Not dramatically, not with thunder or fire, but the way a room changes when a window that's been painted shut for years is finally opened, and air that has been trapped too long finally gets somewhere to go. Kale made a sound, low and surprised, like something had been lifted off his chest that he'd stopped noticing the weight of because he'd been carrying it for so long. The sun came up an hour later. Cale was still human when it did. He hadn't seen a sunrise as himself in 3 years. They stood together at a high window in the east tower, not saying much, because there wasn't much that needed saying right away. Leora had gone to arrange for Voss's quiet departure, with as much dignity and safety for his daughter as the circumstances would allow. Cale had insisted on that much, whatever his anger, because whatever Voss had done wrong, he had also spent 3 years protecting a child who deserved a chance at an ordinary life, and Cale was not interested in becoming the kind of king who punished a man for loving someone the same helpless way Cale himself had recently learned to. "I don't know what I am now," Cale admitted, watching the light climb over the pine hills. "I've spent 3 years defined by what I lost every night. I don't know who I am without that." "You're the same person you were an hour ago," Nora said. "You just get to be him during the daylight too, now." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had that first afternoon in his study, except there was nothing cold in it this time. "You could have walked away from all of this, at any point. You had a dozen good reasons to. I know. Why didn't you?" She thought about the honest answer this time, and decided, since he'd already seen the worst and most vulnerable version of her secret self, that he'd earned the honest answer to this one too. "Because somewhere between the bread and the bandages," she said, "I stopped seeing an animal, and stopped seeing a king, and just saw a person who deserved someone in his corner, and I decided I wanted to be that person, curse or no curse." Cale reached over, slowly, giving her every chance to step back if she wanted to, and when she didn't, he took her hand the way she had taken his in the cellar, not like a king claiming something, but like a man who had finally, after 3 long years, remembered what it felt like to be held onto by someone who had nothing to gain by staying. "Then stay," he said quietly, "not as a maid, not as someone who happened to find out a secret. Stay, because I am asking you to, with the sun up and no chains anywhere in this room." Nora looked out at the pine hills going gold in the early light, at a castle that had spent 3 years hiding its own king from itself, and thought about the long walk that had brought her here, 3 days of worn-out shoes and an empty stomach that had eventually led her, of all the strange places it could have led, to exactly this window, exactly this hand in hers. "I was planning on staying anyway," she said. "You're just going to have better company now than a chain and a cellar floor." Word moved through Blackthorn Castle slowly, the way true things often do, quieter and less dramatic than the rumors that had covered for them the last 3 years. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic unveiling of the king's secret to a startled court. Cale simply began appearing at meals every evening instead of vanishing after sundown, began holding council long past dusk without excuse or explanation, and let the staff draw their own conclusions, which mostly amounted to a vague sense that whatever illness had kept their king distant and disappearing for years had finally, mercifully, lifted. Bet noticed that the new girl, Nora, had somehow ended up spending most of her evenings in the king's company instead of the kitchen's, and muttered something about girls who didn't know their place, but she said it with less bite than she might have a month earlier, because even Bet, who complained about everything, couldn't deny that the king looked like a different man these days. Steadier, less like something wound too tight, more like someone who had finally been allowed to put his shoulders down. Leora found Nora alone one afternoon in the garden and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "He hasn't laughed in 3 years," Leora said. "Not once, not really. I'd almost forgotten what it sounded like." "He laughed at breakfast," Nora said. "Something about the eggs." "I know," Leora said, and there was something bright and a little wet in her eyes that she blinked away quickly. "I was there. I just wanted to say it to someone, out loud, because I still can't quite believe it." Voss left the castle a fortnight later, with far less ceremony than a man who had served the crown for 30 years might have expected, though Cale made certain the leaving was gentle rather than punishing. He was granted a small stone cottage in a quiet village 2 valleys over, close enough to where his daughter already lived that he could finally, for the first time in years, sit at supper with her every single evening instead of stealing brief, guarded visits between his duties at the castle. Kale sent along enough coin to see the two of them comfortable for years, not as payment for silence, he was careful to explain, but as thanks for a debt Voss had spent 3 years quietly, painfully repaying in his own way, long before anyone had asked him to. Nora walked with Kale to the edge of the castle grounds the morning Voss departed, standing back a respectful distance while the two men spoke alone for a long while beside the loaded cart. She couldn't hear the words, but she watched Voss's shoulders, bent for so long under the weight of what he'd carried, straightened by careful degrees as the conversation went on. And when the old steward finally climbed up beside his daughter, who had come to help him pack, and did not yet know the whole of what her father had done for her, he looked back at Kale and inclined his head, not a servant's bow, but something closer to the nod one man gives another when a difficult account has finally, honestly, been settled between them. The old coal cellar was cleaned out within the month, the chain removed, the walls scrubbed and whitewashed, the whole space turned, at Kale's own insistence, into something else entirely. He never said exactly what he wanted done with it, only that it should stop being a place that reminded anyone of chains, and by the time Nora saw it finished, it had become a small, warm room with proper windows cut into the stone, shelves for books, and a rug thick enough to sit on without feeling the cold underneath. "What is this supposed to be?" she asked him, standing in the doorway. "Somewhere to sit," Kale said, "when either of us needs somewhere quiet, somewhere that used to mean something terrible and now means something else instead. I wanted to be the one who changed what it meant." Nora looked around the room, at the light coming in clean and unbothered through windows that hadn't existed a month ago, at the warm rug where cold stone used to be, at the man standing in front of her who had spent 3 years being afraid of exactly this kind of gentleness, because gentleness had always come with a price attached, and who was choosing, deliberately and in full daylight, to believe it might not have to anymore. They spent that first evening in the new room the way they'd spent so many nights before it existed, sitting close, talking about nothing important, Kale reading a page aloud from some old book of his father's, just because he liked the sound of her laughing at the parts that hadn't aged well, Nora leaning her head against his shoulder in a way that would have scandalized the whole court a season earlier, and now felt like the simplest, most obvious thing in the world. "I used to dread the dark," Kale admitted at one point, watching the last light fade purple through the new windows. "Every single evening, for 3 years, I watched the sun go down and felt something in my chest go cold, because I knew what was coming, and I knew there was nothing I could do to stop it. I think some part of me is still waiting for it, still bracing even now when the sun starts to set." "That's fair," Nora said gently. 3 years doesn't unlearn itself in a month." "No," he agreed, "but it helps, having someone in the room who isn't afraid of the dark either." She thought about that for a long moment, about all the nights she'd sat in a cold cellar, with no light but a thin strip of moon, unafraid in a way she hadn't fully understood until just now, that she had never once, from that very first night, been afraid of what was in the dark with her, only sad for it, and determined, in her own quiet and stubborn way, to make it less alone. Outside, the pine hills had gone green with early summer, and somewhere below the castle walls, a road wound off toward 3 villages Nora had once walked away from without looking back. She didn't regret the walking. She didn't regret any of the 3 days it had taken, the worn shoes, the empty stomach, the uncertainty of showing up at a castle door with nothing but calloused hands and a willingness to work. It had brought her here, to a room that used to be a cage, and had learned, the same way its king had learned, how to become something else entirely. That was the last anyone in Blackthorn Castle ever saw of the kennel beast. What they saw instead, evening after evening from then on, was their king, steady, present, unhidden, walking the garden paths at dusk, with a kitchen girl who had never once, from the very first night, been afraid of him. And if anyone ever wondered why the new steward's quarters stood suspiciously empty, or why the old coal cellar had become the king's favorite room in the whole castle, nobody in Blackthorn ever found out the real answer. Some secrets, once they've finally been allowed to heal, simply get to stay that way.